Bangkok's sky was being suffocated beneath a slab of dull lead-gray gloom. Dense, aggressive cumulonimbus clouds packed the air. They sank low as if to crush the rain-soaked skyscrapers. Rain no longer fell in drops. It slammed down like an ocean, flipped upside down from the heavens, erasing every boundary between sky and ground in the industrial hub of Ayutthaya. Fortified perimeter walls were ripped apart in an instant. Muddy, blood-red floodwater surged in, swallowing machines and vehicles whole. The city had now become a gigantic swamp. The lights of civilization blinked out as substations exploded one after another in the rain, leaving behind a chilling, pitch-dark void, where only the roar of the water god remained, and the hopeless thrum of rescue helicopters tearing through the night. Ancient trees were ripped up by the roots. Power poles toppled, dragging down tangled webs of cables, turning them into deadly electrical traps beneath the bubbling floodwater. Luxury cars drifted aimlessly, collided, then sank, vanishing into nothingness. People were small and powerless, clinging to floating debris, with stunned eyes, watching their homes disappear beneath water deeper than 16 feet. Today's hypothetical scenario will take us into the epicenter of a double catastrophe as nature unleashes its brutal fury on Thailand. And neighboring Cambodia has quietly prepared a ruthless geopolitical counterstrike, exploiting its opponent's exhaustion to completely reshape the balance of power in Southeast Asia. The clock struck exactly 9 p.m. A spine-prickling silence settled over the lower Chao Phraya River. Above, black clouds churned thick, blotting out every trace of starlight. Humidity hit saturation, making every breath feel heavy at the Chao Phraya Dam, the final barricade protecting the central plain and the heart of Bangkok. Engineers stood on the edge of despair. Water pressure at the dam face had far exceeded its design limits. The hiss of wind mixed with tremors from deep underground, forming a speeding rhythm. Then a muffled, suffocating boom erupted from within the reinforced concrete. An enormous lightning-shaped crack tore across the dam for hundreds of meters. In less than 30 seconds, a colossal wall of water more than 33 feet high, with kinetic force equivalent to thousands of tons of TNT, crashed down on the downstream areas. It didn't flow, it erased everything, a terrifying force that flattened riverside towns. Even the sturdiest structures were torn from their foundations. Shattered to pieces, water no longer babbled. It was a world-shaking, apocalyptic roar, grinding everything down, from cars and power poles to the very bones of massive infrastructure. In Bangkok, the disaster didn't come from above. It surged up from underground. The strongest dike system was breached at more than 20 critical points at the same time. Water didn't spill over the levees. It blasted back up through storm drains and cracks in the pavement, turning bustling streets into deadly rivers in just minutes. Tension escalated to a suffocating peak as the government declared the highest state of emergency, a level that had never been used in modern history. People had only minutes to climb to the top floor before the ground level was completely submerged. All of Thailand trembled in absolute terror, facing destruction they had never prepared to confront. But to understand why this trigger point became so devastating, we have to turn back the clock to 6 months earlier. Scientific and astronomical data had quietly warned of an apocalyptic scenario from very early on, an unusually, extremely prolonged La Niña phenomenon. It completely reshaped atmospheric dynamics across Southeast Asia. Sea surface temperatures in the Western Pacific rose to record highs, creating a colossal volume of water vapor accumulating in the troposphere. These atmospheric rivers kept dumping relentlessly over the upper Mekong and Chao Phraya basins. Rainfall was more than 40% higher than average. Massive water masses built up behind 2 mega dams, Bhumibol and Sirikit, hitting red alert levels from the very start of the rainy season. However, a systemic mistake occurred. Complacency in water resource management, combined with miscalculations of flood cycles from outdated forecasting models, made officials hesitate to conduct proactive releases. They feared releasing water too early would harm crops. But that hesitation turned the reservoirs into hydraulic bombs hanging over millions of people's heads. While nature was stockpiling destructive energy, the defensive system was cracking from within political conflicts between the central government and Bangkok. Paralyzed the coordination of rescue resources. Water level reports were distorted. Flow sensors at critical hydrological stations were neglected and left without maintenance. As a result, the data sent back to the operations center was completely wrong compared with what was actually happening on the ground. When the first rains of Super Typhoon Propiran poured down, the most critical sensors were clogged with mud or were smashed beyond repair by powerful currents, leaving the early warning system blind at the most decisive hour. The true trigger event came when Tropical Storm Praparan did not weaken as expected after moving inland. Instead, it encountered a stationary tropical trough, creating a rare meteorological resonance effect known as a giant water pump. This cyclonic structure continuously sucked moisture from the Gulf of Thailand and poured it straight into the river basin with unimaginable intensity. Recorded rainfall at some locations reached up to 19.7 inches in just 24 hours. Under that pressure, ground already saturated for months could no longer absorb a single additional drop. A dangerous geological phenomenon began to unfold. Large-scale soil liquefaction along riverbanks. Earthen levees once considered solid suddenly turned mushy like thin porridge, losing their load-bearing strength. The moment the main upstream dam failed, it wasn't just a technical accident. It was a cascading collapse of the entire defense system. As billions of cubic meters of water began surging south, it carried millions of tons of silt, rotten timber, and industrial waste, turning the flood into a thick, abrasive mixture capable of grinding down and destroying anything it touched. In Bangkok, data centers and power grid control stations were flooded first, cutting off all international communications. GPS positioning across the region was disrupted by a sudden shift in atmospheric water vapor density, leaving air rescue units unable to identify targets in the darkness that swallowed everything. People could only hear the shrieking roar of floodwater creeping into every alley, every basement. Terror peaked when residents realized the surrounding walls had now become walls that blocked their escape, trapping them inside a colossal water snare. The beginning of this catastrophe wasn't merely a natural accident. It was proof of civilization's helplessness before a scenario that had surpassed every scientific calculation. Thailand officially entered the darkest hours in its history, where every second that passed was measured in lives. The power of the Great Flood was no longer an abstract concept on weather reports. It had become a tangible physical entity, crushing the backbone of Thailand's economy. 7 massive industrial estates in Pathum Thani and Ayutthaya were submerged beneath torrents of murky floodwater, with flow speeds reaching a terrifying 88,000 cubic feet per second, generating immense pressure that tore apart the reinforced walls of factories producing the world's leading electronic components. Automated assembly lines worth billions of US dollars, once the pride of modern industry, were now nothing more than piles of rusting scrap buried beneath deep layers of sludge. This physical nightmare quickly evolved into a global economic shockwave. Thailand, which once accounted for up to 40% of the world's hard drive market, suddenly vanished from the global manufacturing map. From Silicon Valley to major technology conglomerates in Tokyo, supply chains were completely severed. Prices of electronic components on international markets skyrocketed by the hour. Thousands of containers packed with export goods were swept away by the floodwaters, smashing into one another and shattering apart, creating a scene of devastation resembling a carpet bombing campaign at the heart of the storm. Civilization's arrogance collapsed completely before raw survival instinct. Bangkok, a city once glowing with lights, was now drowned in a horrifying mixture of sewage, engine oil, and medical waste. Even the most advanced hospitals, such as Siriraj, were paralyzed. When backup generators and basement levels were flooded, doctors and nurses were forced to perform life-or-death surgeries under the dim glow of flashlights. While rescue helicopters circled endlessly overhead, unable to land because rooftops were already packed with people. The stench of death began to spread, mixed with the sharp odor of thick mud and leaking chemicals. Overloaded rescue boats capsized in violent whirlpools, sweeping away the last remaining efforts. People fought desperately over a single bottle of clean water, a packet of instant noodles atop scorching metal rooftops. The chaos had slipped beyond the military's control. Groups of starving, desperate people began breaking into supermarkets, searching for basic necessities, creating scenes of lawlessness in the heart of the city. However, the true tragedy lay not only in what the floodwaters were destroying, but also in what was unfolding to the east as Thailand writhed under nature's fury. A ruthless geopolitical counterstrike had begun. The Cambodian government saw a once-in-a-millennium opportunity in the collapse of its rival, exploiting the fact that the Thai military was fully absorbed in disaster relief. Phnom Penh abruptly ordered the launch of a territorial restoration operation, tank treads grinding along roads toward the disputed Priya Vihir temple, shattering the silence. Taking advantage of disrupted surveillance satellites and crippled defense communications, Cambodia announced a partial blockade of the lower Mekong flows under its control, arguing it was an act of self-defense. In reality, it was a stranglehold on Thailand's remaining hydroelectric stations. At sea, Cambodian patrol vessels pushed deeper into disputed, exclusive economic zones containing massive natural gas reserves. With the Thai Navy tied down by rescue operations, Cambodia unilaterally established radar and supply outposts on small rocky islands. They understood that once Thailand managed to pull itself out of the quagmire, the maritime order would already have been completely reshaped. Pressure intensified further as Cambodia adjusted discharge levels at upstream hydropower dams, creating an invisible wall of water, blocking flood drainage from eastern Thai provinces. This prevented water levels from receding, completely draining Bangkok's national reserve capacity. While in international diplomatic forums, Cambodia abruptly shifted posture after securing a hard strategic counterweight. They put forward sovereignty claims over an additional 6 disputed frontier zones. This was a cold, calculated geopolitical hand, using the very power of water to force the opponent into a point of no return. Thailand's struggle for survival was now caught between two crushing jaws. Scattered gunfire began echoing at abandoned border checkpoints. Thai forces now faced Cambodia's regular army occupying strategic positions. Every meter of seized ground was a knife in the artery, turning the flood into a brutal regime change. Thailand had not only lost property, they had lost control of their own destiny. Rivers that once brought life had now been turned into weapons of annihilation. And the one holding the key to those flows was smiling at the collapse of an empire. Chaos reached its peak. A new order was being rewritten in mud, blood, and betrayal. When the final rain stopped completely, the waters began to recede, revealing a country in a form never seen before. Thailand appeared like a gigantic scar, slashed open by thick sludge and destruction. More than 800 souls were swallowed by the water. Thousands more were still missing beneath deep mud. But human death was only the beginning of a far more terrifying chain collapse. 6 million hectares of farmland had become bleached wastelands, coated in sand and toxic chemicals. Entire harvests were erased, driving global rice prices to record highs, triggering food riots. In poor countries dependent on Thailand's supply, estimated losses surpassed $45 billion USD. But the real figure was far greater. As foreign investor confidence evaporated, tech giants from Japan, the United States, and South Korea looked at ruined factories and shattered infrastructure, and a massive capital flight began. Multinational corporations announced supply chain shifts in unison, leaving an exhausted Thailand with empty industrial zones turned into gigantic industrial graveyards. The baht went into freefall, pushing the country into its worst financial crisis since 1997. Transport infrastructure was now nothing but twisted segments of high-speed rail, like useless steel wires. Bridges snapped in half, and Suvarnabhumi International Airport became a giant dumping ground after the waters receded while the nation's internal strength was completely spent. With domestic resources fully drained, the Thai government was forced to face a second front: diplomacy and sovereignty. The international community was trapped in a geopolitical labyrinth laid by Cambodia. At the United Nations, emergency sessions deadlocked as Cambodia backed quietly from behind the scenes, kept presenting fabricated evidence that Thailand had caused cross-border water pollution. Phnom Penh cleverly played the victim of contamination to demand international monitoring of disputed areas. In reality, a move to legitimize the occupation of strategic positions their forces had seized. Cambodia's counterstrike peaked when it used hydrological warfare as a bargaining chip. By tightly controlling downstream flows and river mouths connected to Thailand's canal network, Cambodia directly obstructed the agricultural recovery of eastern Thailand's plains. In desperation, buried under public debt and needing reconstruction capital, Bangkok was pushed into an unfavorable negotiating position. A resource-sharing agreement over oil and gas in the disputed seas was signed in Bangkok's bitterness, with Cambodia winning the right to exploit most of the reserves, stripping away critical budget revenue needed for recovery. Reactions from other neighboring countries were not much better. Thailand's collapse created a power vacuum. ASEAN nations split deeply between supporting Thailand and adapting to a new order, one in which Cambodia was rising powerfully as a new hub of energy and water control. This shift wasn't only economic. It was a strategic transfer of power. The Mekong power axis had changed hands. And the price Thailand paid was the loss of foreign policy autonomy. The Thai government had to accept bailout packages with harsh conditions from financial institutions. Debt traps began to tighten, turning the country into a long-term debtor, losing its ability to decide its own infrastructure. This cascading collapse from disaster to economics and politics completed a ruthless loop. A nation once the pride of Southeast Asia now faced a bleak future where every cubic foot of water crossing the border carried the threat of a new conflict. And every attempt to stand back up was squeezed by enslaving treaties signed in the darkest hour. Bangkok after the flood was no longer the city of smiles. Skyscrapers now bore yellowed stains like gray tombstones, marking civilization's fragility before nature. Thailand, once an economic tiger, was now only an exhausted ghost, struggling to borrow its way back to rebuilding. Meanwhile, the border disputes with Cambodia had become an open wound that kept bleeding, turning the region into a tense flashpoint where distrust weighed down every attempt at international cooperation. The warning lesson after the Great Flood was a brutal truth. When humans destroy the environment in exchange for development, nature will retaliate with a price beyond measure, and compassion is not always present. Sometimes, one nation's disaster becomes the springboard for another power's expansionist ambition. Water can sustain life. But when water is turned into a geopolitical weapon, it can wash away civilization itself. The collapse of a great power doesn't begin with gunfire. It begins with arrogance before Mother Nature. The world must now learn to live with a new reality, where apocalyptic scenarios lurk in every cloud.